Okay, so today we're gonna really try to get to the bottom of this whole XLR cable thing.
Yeah,
You've probably seen them, I mean, those expensive XLR cables that promise like studio grade audio and amazing sound quality.
right.
But are they actually worth all that extra money, or is it just a bunch of marketing hype, for what's basically expensive wire?
Yeah, it's a question that audio people have been debating for years and years.
For sure.
And we're going to see if we can get to the bottom of it today.
Yeah, we're diving into the world of XLR cables with some help from a really cool forum for audio professionals and a music producer who's been mixing for decades.
Right.
So we're kind of coming at it from both those angles, the more technical side and the actual real world experience side.
Yeah, definitely a good mix.
So first up, let's head over to the Audio Science Review Forum. Now, this forum is known for its hardcore technical analysis. I mean, these guys are serious about audio.
Yeah, they don't mess around.
They actually measure the performance of different gear, and they did exactly that with XLR cables. They did this whole battle of the budget XLR cables thing,
I saw that.
where they tested out a bunch of different cables, a classic Canair, a cordial, a monoprice, even a fake Canair cable from AliExpress
Oh, yeah.
to see if they could actually hear a difference.
Right, because that's the big question, right?
Exactly.
Does spending more actually get you better sound?
Okay, so what did they find? Did the cheap cables burst into flames?
Well, no, not exactly.
Right.
But what's interesting is that their findings kind of go against that whole expensive equals better
Okay.
idea.
Okay.
In a controlled environment using, standard audio equipment, a lot of the budget XLR cables perform pretty much the same as the pricier ones.
Wait, so you're telling me I could be using a cable that costs like a third of the price
Yeah, potentially.
and get basically the same sound quality?
In many cases, yes.
That's wild. Okay, but how did they even test that? Like, how do you measure the sound of a cable?
Right. So they used a few different methods, but one of the key ones was something called Rightmark Audio Analyzer.
Okay.
And basically, this software lets you measure things like frequency response, which is how well the cable transmits all the different sound frequencies.
Okay.
They also looked at things like noise levels, dynamic range,
Right.
which is the difference between the loudest and quietest sounds the cable can handle, and a bunch of other technical stuff. And the results were pretty surprising. I mean, aside from that fake Canair cable, which we'll get to in a minute, the measurements for all the other cables were incredibly close.
So basically, to the average listener, the difference would be like almost impossible to hear.
Exactly.
Wow.
Especially in a typical home studio setup.
Right. If you're not like a professional audio engineer.
Yeah, like those guys with the $1 million studios might hear a difference.
Right.
But for most people, a well-made budget cable is going to sound just as good.
That's pretty amazing when you think about it.
It is. It really challenges the assumptions we have about audio gear.
Okay, so let's talk about that fake Canair cable for a second.
Yeah.
What was up with that? Did it like melt or something?
Well, no, it didn't melt, but it did have some issues. So basically, they found that the pins on the fake cable were wired incorrectly, which really messed up the signal and caused a lot of noise and interference.
So it's not just about price, then it's also about making sure you're buying from a reputable source.
Absolutely. You don't want to end up with a cable that's actually going to damage your equipment because it's poorly made.
Right. You got to be careful about those deals that seem too good to be true.
Exactly.
All right, so we've heard from the tech experts now. Let's get a real-world perspective.
Yeah.
For our next source, we're going to hear from a music producer who's been mixing for decades.
Okay.
He actually runs an online course for people who want to learn how to mix and master their own music.
Nice.
And he had some really interesting things to say about XLR cables.
Yeah.
So he basically said, if your cables are working fine, don't feel like you need to rush out and buy expensive ones.
Yeah.
Just because you think it's going to magically improve your sound.
He's totally right.
Yeah.
There's this idea that more expensive gear automatically equals better sound, and that's not always true.
Yeah.
Especially with cables. I mean, think about it. A cable's job is pretty simple.
Right, it's just carrying the signal.
Exactly. So he's really emphasizing build quality and reliability, especially for live performances.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Where cables are getting plugged in and unplugged all the time.
Stuffed in bags thrown around.
Exactly. So you want something that can take a beating.
Right, you don't want your cable dying on you in the middle of a gig.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's two sources now, both saying basically the same thing about expensive cables.
Right. And it's interesting to see that perspective from both the technical side
Yeah.
and from someone who's actually out there using this gear every day.
Totally. Okay, so for our last source, we found this blog post that really dives into the technical details of what makes a premium cable different.
Okay.
But then it goes on to say that in most studio setups, you probably wouldn't even hear the difference.
Right. It's kind of like those blind taste tests with wine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, can you really tell the difference between a $20 bottle and a $200 bottle?
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes you can't.
So what are they saying makes these premium cables so special if you can't even hear the difference?
Well, they talk about a few things, but one of the big ones is shielding.
Shielding.
Yeah, so basically premium cables often use better shielding to reduce electromagnetic interference.
Okay, so like that annoying hum you sometimes get.
Exactly. It's like wrapping your audio signal in a protective bubble.
I like that analogy. So if my studio is basically a giant electromagnetic field with computers and monitors and everything plugged in,
Yeah.
then better shielding would be super important.
It could make a difference, for
Right,
sure.
okay, that makes sense. And they talked about conductors too. What are those?
So conductors are basically the wires inside the cable that actually carry the audio signal.
Okay.
And premium cables often use higher quality conductors like silver or oxygen-free copper.
Fancy.
Yeah. And because these materials have lower resistance, they can transmit the signal with more accuracy.
So better materials, better signal. But is it really a night and day difference?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And like a lot of things in audio, it depends on what
I'm on your
equipment, your listening environment, even your own ears.
Okay, so like some people might be able to hear those subtle differences.
Exactly. Especially if you've got a really high-end listening setup and you're really paying attention.
Right.
But for most people in a typical home studio, those differences are going to be really, really subtle.
So it's like you're paying a premium for something that you might not even be able to hear.
Kind of, yeah. It's about finding the right balance between quality and cost.
Right. Because at the end of the day, it's still just a cable.
Exactly.
Okay, so where does this all leave us? We've got these different sources, some saying all XLR cables sound the same, others saying that premium cables do make a difference.
Right. It's a lot to process.
It is. So how do we even begin to make sense of all this?
Well, I think it's helpful to take a step back and think about our priorities.
Like what should we be looking for when deciding if it's time to upgrade our cables or if we can stick with what we have?
Carl, I think the first thing is to just be honest with yourself about your needs and your budget.
Okay, so like if I'm just recording myself playing guitar in my bedroom,
Right.
I probably don't need to be dropping hundreds of dollars on fancy cables.
Probably not. I mean, unless you really want to.
Right.
But if you're running a professional studio or you're doing a lot of live gigs.
Right, where those cables are really getting used.
Exactly. Then it might make sense to invest in some higher-end cables that are going to hold up better over time.
That makes sense. So besides the obvious, like if my cable is literally falling apart.
Right. Frayed wires, sparking connectors.
Exactly. What are some other signs that it might be time for an upgrade?
Well, one thing to watch out for is noise. Yeah, like if you're constantly getting hum or buzz in your recordings and you've already checked your equipment and your grounding.
Right, so it's not like the refrigerator or anything.
Exactly. Then it could be your cables, especially if you're in an environment with a lot of electronic interference.
So basically, if I hear a weird hum and I unplug everything around me and the hum is still there,
Right.
then it might be the cable.
It's definitely a possibility.
Okay, good to know. What about just like the overall sound quality? If I feel like my recordings are sounding a little muddy or dull,
Okay, yeah, that's interesting.
could it be the cables?
It's possible, but I would say that in most cases it's going to be something else,
Like what?
like your microphone or your preamp or even the acoustics of the room you're recording in.
Right, all that other stuff we've talked about before?
Right? Exactly. Those things are going to have a much bigger impact on your sound than your cables.
So basically, start with the bigger things.
Yeah.
And then if you're still not happy with the sound, then you can start looking at the cable.
Exactly. And remember those blind taste tests we were talking about?
Yeah. The wine?
It's kind of the same with cables. You might not even be able to hear the difference between a budget cable and a premium cable.
Unless you've got like super hearing.
Right. So don't stress too much about it. Just make sure you're buying from a reputable source.
Right, a brand you trust.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that your cables are in good physical condition.
And if they're not,
Then it's probably time for an upgrade.
this has been a really eye-opening deep dive.
Yeah, I agree.
I feel like I've learned a lot about XLR cables, and I'm actually feeling a little bit better about my budget now.
That's great. It's all about finding the right balance for you.
Exactly. Well, thanks for joining me on this sonic adventure.
Anytime. Always happy to talk audio.
And to all our listeners out there, happy recording.